All right, the camera is rolling. Hello and welcome to the Clinton County Veterans Oral History Project. This is Nick Wiget, Communication Arts at Wilmington College, and I have with me Larry Stanley, a veteran from Clinton County. Larry, welcome.
Thank you.
Hi, we're going to talk to you a little bit today about your military service and about your memories and your experiences, and we thank you for joining us. If you would please, give us your full name.
Larry A. Stanley.
What's your date of birth?
It's February 13th, 1931.
What branch of service did you serve in?
I joined the Air Force,
What's the highest rank you attained?
Senior Master Sergeant. I turned down Chief Master Sergeant to retire. I didn't want to have my family experience another overseas tour.
Did you serve during a war or a conflict?
I was in Japan during the occupation, during part of the occupation, and I was there when the Korean War started, so they considered me a veteran of the Korean War, although I never saw Korea. And I was in Vietnam during the Vietnam War, and I was in France during the Cold War.
So you've served in many capacities in several places.
Oh, yes, yes.
Okay. Let's go back to the very beginning for you, Larry. Tell me a little bit about where you were born, who your parents were, and what they did.
Yeah. I was born in Hurricane, West Virginia, on February 13th, 1931. My dad was kind of a jack of all trades. He, a salesman. He sold produce from door to door in the coal camp areas. He sold Singer sewing machines. He had a demonstrator in the rumble seat of his car, and he would take orders from the farm women. And at the end of the day, he usually sold a demonstrator, and they paid him mostly in quarters from their egg and butter money. And during most of this time, he had a job at Kroger's, and he would get salt and sugar and flour and coffee, take it out into the country and trade it for produce. So I have, my youngest son is the salesman of the family. He inherited that, I think.
Did you ever go with your dad when he went on some of these trips?
I did. He also had a part-time job as a rural mail carrier. And I would ride with him, and most of the roads, once we got 5 miles out of town, were gravel, and of course in the winter they turned to mud and slush. So it was an interesting time and interesting goings-on. My mother had an 8th grade education, but she taught elementary school at that time in the 30s. Well, she was teaching actually in the 20s. So I think that's how they met, although they never really told me much of their history. But they were both from large families, and I had aunts and uncles and cousins all over the place.
Brothers and sisters? Siblings?
I have one brother. My baby sister died in 1935 of pneumonia. She lived 11 months. And it's I think about that often. One of my daughters had pneumonia in 1958. She got a shot of penicillin, and we went on our way. So.
Do you come from a military background as far as your parents or?
Not really. My dad was drafted in World War I. He was born in 1900 in July. Shortly after that, he was drafted. And when the war ended in November of 1918, all those guys were sent home. But he had quit school at 16 to help his family. They lived small farm, and after the Army, he went back to high school, graduated at 23. And after that, he had a year of college, ran out of money, and started selling. But when I was about 5 or 6, we moved to a small farm on the edge of town with a large vegetable garden, apple orchard. We had 1 cow, about 50 chickens, and 4 or 5 pigs. So a lot of bartering went on back then. And during the Depression, we gave away a lot of our food to our relatives and friends. Most of my cousins close by were girls, and they wanted me to do the picking and the cleaning for them. So when I was about 14, I rebelled. I said, if you want it, you come and pick it.
Let's talk a little bit about your education. So primary schools, high schools.
I graduated high school when I was 17. And after I'd been in the Air Force about 10 years, I started taking college courses off duty. And I got an AA degree from a college in California. I attended the University of the Philippines, University of Dayton, Wilmington College for 4 or 5 courses. But when I retired from the Air Force, the children were still pretty small, so I had to continue working.
Did you have any jobs before entering the service, like in between high school?
High school, my first job, I think, was dealing a footer for a house for a contractor with a pick and a shovel. And I think he probably thought I was too slow, so he didn't call me back next summer.
That's too much like work, right?
Right. I had one job in a warehouse that was by the railroad track, and the warehouse stored empty steel drums with the covers off. So we had a crew of maybe 6 people, 6 boys, and we would take the steel drums, and when they came in, we would stack them up, and when we had a shipment out, we would load them on the freight cars. Summers in West Virginia are hot, and we consumed a great deal of water. And I think one of the guys said, you know what? I said, we probably better get an education. We don't want to do this the rest of our lives.
Well, tell us about when you went into the military. How did that come about?
One of our friends from our graduating class, 3 of us enlisted at the same time. This friend had an older brother who'd been in the Navy after World War II, and he was also a friend of ours, so, you know, so to speak. And he was promoting the Navy. He thought it was a great deal. So 3 of us, I think we were in 11th grade, decided we would join the Navy when we graduated. But the brother of the younger brother of our friend backed out. He decided to get married, which made him exempt from the draft at that time. And so the 2 of us went to the Navy recruiter in Huntington, West Virginia, and did some preliminary testing. And the recruiter pointed to me and said, well, you can go now or next week if you want. And he told my buddy Ray, he says, you need to lose, you know, 6 or 7 pounds, and we'll take you then. And I said, well, I'm not going without him. And we went home, and Ray went on a diet. This was in first part of August, 1948. And we were all looking at the draft. But while Ray was losing the weight, another friend, Bill, he was 18, he decided he would join us. So the end of August, near the end of August, it was the 23rd, we're back in the recruiting office, and I was actually in the federal building in Huntington. We're going down this long hall to the Navy office, and a guy in an Air Force sergeant, still in the Army uniform, the Air Force was only a year old, stepped out of his office and said, hey boys, where are you going? And we said, we're going to go down here and join the Navy. And he said, well, let me tell you about the new Air Force. Maybe I can give you a better deal. So that's been the topic of the conversation in our family for a long time.
That's a great story. I was just going to ask how you ended up in the Air Force when you intended to go into the Navy. When you decided to join the Navy, though, why the Navy?
Well, primarily because of our friend, but of course, and during World War II, you heard the slogan all the time, join the Navy and see the world. And of course, you know how 17-year-olds are. So that was our big deal. We were going to join the Navy.
Okay, well, you joined the Air Force instead.
Right.
Where did you go to first? What was your initial point of entry?
We rode a train to Lackland Air Force Base near San Antonio, Texas. 3 days on the train, coal-burning engine, windows open, soot blowing on you, cold water to try to wash in, hardly any sleep. So,
was that the worst part of your military experience?
No,
Okay.
not really.
Well, I know we'll get to that, but
well, I would like to continue there because
yeah.
the worst part was at Lackland, Texas.
Yeah.
The first day we got there around 11 in the morning, and we went through the drill and lectures and haircuts, and they issued us our uniforms. We had to pack up our civilian clothes, except what we had on. We didn't change into our uniforms until later. But that night we were exhausted, so we went to bed at dark, and the next morning they woke us up at 5 o'clock, and we discovered that we'd all been robbed. There were 60 of us in the barracks, and whoever stole our belongings just went through. We hung our clothes on a rack, and being so tired, nobody woke up. So that morning, no military training, we were interviewed by criminal investigators in civilian clothes. I later found out they were probably Air Force staff sergeants, but we never heard anything about what we lost. I lost my wallet. I had a copy of my birth certificate. Lost a $10 bill that my dad had given me when I got on the train. So that was the worst part of my Air Force experience. Nothing was ever recovered. No mention of it was ever made again after that day.
Makes you wonder if other people in the area knew that the recruits were coming in and they were going to be exhausted, maybe.
It had to have been, I hate to say it, one or more of the trainers, because nobody else had access to us or to our barracks.
Yeah. That's a terrible start.
Yeah.
That's so discouraging right from the beginning.
Yeah. I figured then, boy, what have I gotten myself into?
Sure, of course. Let's go on and talk a little bit about training or schooling that you had right after you started. What were some of the things that you went through initially?
The basic training, of course, by the way, it was 13 weeks. And when we finished, we were all promoted to PFC, Private First Class. We were still using the Army terms, the Army uniforms. The only thing different was we had what they called the upside down stripes. And some people called them the Canadian stripes. So
why did they call them Canadian stripes?
the Canadian uniform, as I understand, for years, the stripes have been upside down. And I believe maybe some of the Civil War stripes were upside down. I'd have to look that up again.
What's your most vivid memory of that time? What was the best part of the training?
Probably on the rifle range. We grew up, the kids, we're still kids. We grew up with rifles when we started when we were 12 or 13. 22s. It was kind of fun to fire a 30 caliber weapon.
So you felt like you got bigger and cooler toys.
Right, exactly.
Do any of the instructors particularly stick out in your mind? Do you remember them?
Not really. I think the bad experience in the beginning kind of made us turn inward and try to forget the bad stuff.
Sure. What was your first assignment after basic training?
The three of us volunteered for Japan. We had the choice of several schools, but we wanted to go overseas. Actually, we volunteered for Germany, and they sent us to Japan. So,
close, huh?
Yes.
Tell me a little bit about that, your first experience. Is this your first experience out of the United States?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. On the we got out of basic training early November. Had about 3 weeks at home, which of course we had to pay for, on a train again. Much better that time because it was cooler, and we had our army style wool uniforms. So at home I was I'm a little apprehensive about going overseas. I just wasn't sure that I had done the right thing. But on the trip back to California by train again, the civilians treated us with a great deal of courtesy and respect. World War II had been over, 3.5 years, and made you feel good, like, well, maybe I can contribute something. So we got on a World War II troop ship January 2nd, 1949. And the sailor says, "Oh boy, here comes some fresh meat." Said, "You guys, you don't know what you're getting into." So we kind of waved it off, But about 3 days later, half the ship was seasick, and it was horrible. And I was down in E deck below the waterline, and the hammocks were about maybe 20 inches apart. And if you tried to sleep on your side, your shoulder would rub the guy above you. And heaven help you if the guy on top got seasick. So, and the stairs were horrible. I felt sorry for the Navy guys who tried to clean up. But after a few days, it settled down.
How long were you out there on the ship?
2 weeks.
Was that long enough?
That was plenty long enough. I lived mostly on fresh fruit to avoid the queasiness. And we stayed on deck as long as we could, even in the bitter winter winds. It was better than being down in the hold. There were several hundred of us on that ship, and we were all miserable. But the ship would roll, and then it would buck. So, if the showers were salt water, so if you took a shower, you felt dirty and sticky. It's a good thing it was winter time. We didn't take many showers. And if you tried to eat the food in the galley, you had a metal table about chest high, a metal tray with your food in it. The ship would roll, your tray would slide. So the guy over here would send it back to you. And I really, at that time, felt sorry for the guys in World War II who had to put up with that. It was really, I don't know how to describe it. It was not a pleasant trip.
At that time, did you qualify with any sort of equipment, or were you training on something?
No, we were in Japan about 5 days, and the first sergeant gathered about 300 of us in a huge theater, and it had aisles down the sides, and they had us seated in alphabetical order. My buddy Bill Campbell was on one side, Ray Grossel was in the middle, and I was with the S's and the W's on the other side. So the sergeant stood up and said, "Okay, you guys over here on my left, you're going to Okinawa. You guys in the middle are staying in Japan, and you guys over on the right are going to Guam." So they split us up there, and 3 days later I was on another ship. So this one, it didn't buck. It rolled somewhat, but the sea was once we got pretty much past Okinawa, where we dropped Bill off, the sea was fairly calm. So it was a more pleasant trip, and every day it would get warmer. And we stopped in Manila for some reason, and they gave us 12 hours. They let us off the ship from noon to midnight. And Manila is a beautiful city, and at that time, the war debris had pretty much been cleaned up. So we just pretty much walked along Dewey Boulevard and had a meal in a restaurant, had a couple of beers. I shouldn't say that, I was 17. And got back on the ship, and the rumors started. They said, hey, a bunch of guys missed the ship because they fell in love with girls here. I never did find, I don't think that was true, but some guy would start a rumor just to have a laugh. But a few days later, we landed at Guam in the evening, and they met us with buses, took us to an area 4 or 5 miles away, and a couple of guys with flashlights walked us to our room for the night, I guess it was. Turned out to be a tent, so that was not too bad. Better than the ship. And the next day we moved into their permanent type housing, which had a lot of screen wire walls, you know, for the heat and humidity. And the next thing, we, about a half, maybe 10 of us were notified that we could try out to be teletype operators. And I had learned to type a little bit in high school, and so that was the only skill I had at that time, other than being an expert rifle shot from basic. But we didn't have any infantry people. So I started my training in a communications building with air-conditioned equipment, which turned out to be pretty good. And we were about, our barracks was maybe 200 yards from the beach, so we spent a lot of time swimming, and we had plenty of good food from the local farmers, plenty of vegetables and fruit, and just like, almost like home. So that wasn't too bad.
Well, this sounds like a day at the beach.
Yes. We had a lot of time off.
Yeah, you go through a lot of the Rockies for a few months when you end up in Guam. How long were you in Guam?
I was only there 3 months. The first sergeant came in one day and said, who would like to go to Iwo Jima for 6 months? And I thought for a minute and held up my hand. He said, okay, you're it. So I had made some good friends on Guam, but he told me, the sergeant told me, that if you go to Iwo Jima, it counts as double time against your tour overseas. It's considered hardship. So a week or so later, I was on an airplane, finally. I wasn't on a ship anymore, flying to Iwo Jima. And I spent my 6 months there.
So you're back in Japan, basically?
Yes, it was considered part of Japan. Yeah, it was under occupation, of course.
Post-World War II, how were the conditions there?
The rubble from the battle, which ended late March of '45, was still there. I have pictures of most of the destroyed guns and tanks and landing craft. The first thing we did, I was by myself this time, just replacing one person. After I'd been there 2 or 3 days, I had a day off, so the first thing we did, we head for the mountain and the scene of the flag raising. A couple of guys, we borrowed a Jeep and rode down to that end of the island, and the Marines had graded a road up the island, a dirt road, after the battle. So we walked up to the top of it and had our pictures taken, and I've got several pictures of that site, including the extinct volcanic crater. I have one picture of a buddy holding me up so I can untangle the flag. And he and I had several meetings over the years in the Air Force after we left there. But we did go to Japan after that. It was the temporary cemeteries on Iwo for the Marines had been cleared out. I believe it was first part of 1949 before I got there, but the area was still marked off limits. And most of, I guess all of those bodies were taken to Hawaii first. I read several histories of the battle of guys that were there. And it was a horrible, horrible battle. I think close to 10,000 Marines were killed. I don't know how many were wounded. Years later, I was reading a history of one of the Marine medical corpsmen who were Navy corpsmen. After the battle, he confessed to his superiors that he was only 15 when he got there. And they sent him home and discharged him after they gave him the Medal of Honor for dragging a few guys out of the line of fire. But I knew his name at one time, but I've forgotten it. I believe he came from Georgia. And of course, I have the book, Flags of Our Fathers, written by, I think his name is James Bradley. His father was the corpsman who helped raise the flag. That flag raising, that the famous picture was the second flag raising. I don't know if you knew that or not. After the first one went up, one of the colonels said, "Hey, we can't see it as well as we should." So he said, "Besides, I want that for my souvenir." So he sent another team up, the ones whose pictures were made, to put up a bigger flag and get him the small one. I think all of these flags are in the Marine Museum, if I'm not mistaken. But it really got me interested in military history. I've always been, anything about military history, I usually pick it up, going back to the Civil War.
Well, you got to live some of it as well. You were there.
Oh, I was there to see that history.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's incredible. That's wonderful.
Yeah, and I turned 18 on Guam, so I was 18 when I left Iwo. Two of us transferred to Japan together. A guy from Harlan, Kentucky. I'll never forget him.
You talked a lot about some of these friends and people. Did you, as the years went by, I know it's tough, but did you stay in contact with some of these folks?
With a lot of them.
Yeah.
And I ran into one of them by accident once. The guy that was holding me up there when I was fixing the flag transferred to Japan about a month after I did. He was our crypto man. He took care of all of the classified information and coded and decoded. And he had the same job in Japan. We worked in the same building together there. And I was still in communications. And he was probably my best friend. But I ran into him again years later in France. Walked into PX and met him face to face. By then he was a captain. And he had gotten out, gone to college, ROTC, got his commission. So in France, he came over to our house, our mobile home, met my wife and my son, Michael. Of course, Mike doesn't remember him. And he was on an inspection tour to our base. He and his wife were stationed in Germany at that time. And then several years later, I stopped to see him at the Air Force Academy, where he was an instructor, Colorado Springs, and met his wife for the first time and had lunch with he and his family. So
we've jumped a little bit here. You were in Asia. How long were you in Asia, and then eventually you make your way over to Europe? Hold on a sec. We'll pause real quick.
Yeah.
The door makes noise too. Thank you. So, okay. I don't want the timeline now. So you're in Asia, you're in Japan, but eventually you make your way over to Europe.
Yeah.
Well, what's the timeline there?
Well, I had several assignments and situations in the States before I went to France. I went to Japan in the fall of '49, and big change. We were living in a what had been a hotel building, I think 5 stories maybe. At that time, the buildings in Japan were all shorter because of earthquakes. And we worked in the headquarters building for the headquarters of the Far Eastern Air Forces, which covered all of Asia. And General MacArthur had an office in the top floor, and we were on the 4th floor, I believe, our communications. So every week or so, we'd be downstairs to watch him come to work. He didn't work there all the time. He had offices in other buildings, but he would always salute us, and we thought this was great. But the difference in being in Iwo Jima, we cut the uniform sleeves off for comfort, and pretty much ignored, uniform regulations. When we got to Tokyo, we had to be spit and polish, so that was a big change. But we went from summer uniforms to the winter uniforms in Japan, and the dry cleaners there were short of dry cleaning fluid because of World War II. And they put a lot of gasoline in their fluid. So we'd get a uniform cleaned and we'd be walking around smelling like a gas station. And the jokers would say, "Don't light up a cigarette."
What was your time in Tokyo? Was that different? That's such a big change, I think, in a lot of ways, culturally.
Yeah, it was totally, well, for the first thing we noticed, they drove on the wrong side of the road. My buddy almost got hit by a car when we'd been there a week. And we told him, look the other left. But the people accepted us. We didn't detect any hostility. I'd been warned. I was wearing the 20th Air Force shoulder patch on my uniform, which I was entitled to from Guam. And the 20th Air Force in World War II had been the ones that firebombed Japan before the atom bomb. And some of the guys said, "You better not wear that patch there." And when I got there, I saw 2 or 3 other guys wearing it, so I wasn't too concerned. But there was never any overt hostility to us. The area was pretty well bombed out. The part of town where we lived in, the bricks were mostly stone, but all around for 2 or 3 miles from where we were, there were just empty water-filled basements that had been buildings. And it made me realize that I was lucky to have been born so that I wasn't involved in that war. And
I was going to mention that you were fortunate in many ways to avoid the conflict.
Right. I lost a cousin in France. He was in General Patton's army, and when I think I was 13, the telegraph operator brought the message to my dad because my aunt lived way out in the country and had no telephone. Asked my dad if he would deliver the message. He had no other way to contact the family. And my dad asked me to go along, but he said, "But don't get out of the car when I get there." So it was only 15 miles, but a lot of it was gravel road, so it took us pretty much 45, 50 minutes at night, bad roads. And that was a duty, of course, I'll never forget. But later on, when my wife and Mike and I were stationed in France, we went to his, he was buried in the military cemetery at Epinal, France, southern France. We were on a vacation trip to Switzerland. We stopped and took pictures of my cousin's headstone and sent pictures to my aunt. And of course, I'll remember him forever. I have one of his pictures in my briefcase of his gravesite.
And you served in Japan. You come back to the States and get married?
After about a year.
Okay.
I came back to, well, I was in Japan an extra year because of the Korean War.
Right.
Yeah, I was due to come home in around the 1st of June of 1950. And the Korean War started June 25th, 1950. So probably 10 of us in my unit were supposed to be on the ship, and we all had to stay an extra year. But our higher-ups didn't send us to Korea because we had already completed our tour, and we were left as a skeleton crew, and they sent the younger guys to set up on air bases that we were building in Korea. So there was one incident in Japan that really was a coincidence. I was walking down the street to work one day, and there's quite a few people on the streets, and our heads are above the Japanese population. And about half a block away, I see this American soldier in uniform coming toward me. I recognized him as a high school classmate. His name was Wiseman, and the W's and the S's sat on the back row in class, so we sat about 3 people from each other. So again, I couldn't believe it. His barracks was a couple of miles from where we stayed, and so we got together quite a few times. And he was sent to Korea after maybe 2 months after I saw him. And the same thing happened again in Vietnam 13 years later. Same guy. I walk into our control tower was on the top of what we called the base operations. I walked into base operations going to work to climb the stairs. He walks in the other door. There were only like 3 of us in the building. James Wiseman, there he is again.
Small world, right?
Small world.
Right.
Well, I mentioned meeting Jim Archer, my friend from Iwo Jima. Another story I have to tell you about France. Our first daughter was being born, and we had to go to the Air Force Base next to us, about 25 miles, for the birth. And it was at night, naturally. We had to drive over narrow, winding French roads to get there. We got there about midnight. We walk in the OB ward. The head nurse is another classmate of mine from Hurricane, West Virginia. I didn't even know she was in the Air Force. So the Air Force at that time would not allow the father in the delivery room. They had too many guys pass out. So the nurse and I were sitting in the waiting room talking about high school. My wife was in there giving birth. I never lived that down. For years and years, my wife would tell all the friends and family, well, he's out there talking to this pretty nurse, and I'm in there having a baby.
But you're coming to find that Hurricane's a bigger place than you thought it was.
Exactly.
Yeah.
There were only like 58 people in our graduating class.
Yeah.
And I meet 2 of them overseas.
That's crazy.
Not knowing. I knew the first guy was in the Army, but I had no idea where.
Yeah.
And,
That's an excellent story, too. That's pretty bittersweet. Well, I don't blame you. Well, at this point now, your family's overseas with you now too, while you're serving.
Yeah, I got off the track when I came back from Japan. We reported to Hamilton Air Force Base. It's just a little north of San Francisco, same place where we had stayed before we shipped out. And we checked in. There were 10 of us, 10 or 12. The first sergeant says, "Well, I don't need you guys, but because the war is still going on, we don't have any money to send you anywhere else. So we'll try to find something for you to do here. I have plenty of teletype operators." And a week or so later, he called me in. He says, I have an opening in the control tower. If you can pass the physical for the job, would you like to try that? And I said, yeah, sign me up. So I started training in the control tower. I was the third guy on the shift. We were that short of people. Usually we had 3 fully trained controllers. And all they said, well, I don't have time to teach you anything, but when the phone rings, you answer it, write down everything they say. I said, don't miss a word. Yes, sir. I didn't say yes, sir. He was a sergeant. But by then, I was a 3-stripe sergeant. And after shortly after that, I got my furlough to go home. And this friend from Kentucky, we got our train tickets as far as, I had a ticket as far as Huntington, but he got off the train at Cincinnati and went on his way. But I had a great reunion with the family. My little brother was a teenager then, and of course I missed a lot of years of his growing up.
I'm sure he admired you.
Oh yeah. Well, he later joined the Air Force when he got out of high school. He was only in 4 years. But got reacquainted with my family, and before my leave was over, I decided I wanted to visit my aunt in next town east of us, St. Albans. So I had a friend from high school, younger guy. He was about the same age as my cousin in St. Albans. I said, well, come along, go with me, and I'll introduce you to my cousin, Carolyn. So we drive up there. It was about 15 miles, and stop at my aunt's house. And there's 2 girls standing in the yard. They didn't know that I was coming. They knew I was home, but they didn't know I was coming. So my cousin introduced me to the other girl. Turned out to be the girl I married a year later, Virginia Harper. Everybody called her Jenny. And a couple of weeks later, I had to go back to California. But we wrote. Our courtship was by mail. She was 17 when we met. I was 20. So I'm back in California writing letters to her. And I had a lot of leave time accrued because I hadn't taken any leave in Japan or overseas. And so I went home again that fall, and we had, we didn't have a date as such. I would just show up at her house and we would go to the movies or something. She lived about, her family had moved, so she lived about 30 miles away in Point Pleasant, West Virginia. And had to go back to California too soon, and continued my training. And almost a year later, I was what they called fully trained, although I wasn't sure about that. It was a very, the field, the work required your undivided attention, for 6 or 8 hours that you were working. But I enjoyed it. I loved the job. And that July, first part of July, 2 of us, one of my buddies from Japan at Iwo Jima, decided that we'd take another leave, but we would hitchhike. So I had an old, yeah, I had an old car, and I knew it wouldn't make it home, so two of our friends drove us to Reno, and we started hitchhiking at Reno about 4 o'clock in the afternoon. Got a ride into somewhere in eastern Utah. And the following day, I think we got a motel that night. But the following day, it took us about 6 hours to get another ride. But that guy had been in World War II, and he was a civilian traveling salesman. He took us all the way to the east side of Denver. And not long, we were standing by the road maybe a half hour, and a sailor picked us up. He was going to Kansas City, Missouri. And we helped him with the gas and the driving. Well, he dropped us off there. And then we got a few more rides into Louisville, Kentucky. And I'm standing on the highway on the east side of Louisville. We would switch off. One day I'd wear the uniform, the next day he'd wear his. The Korean War was still going on, so we had no trouble getting rides. And the salesman, I didn't know he was a salesman at the time, a single guy in the car. He drove on by us and he stopped. And then he backed up and he looked at me and he says, "Is your name Stanley?" I said, "Yes." He said, "I know your dad." He said, "Hop in." He took us to my front door.
That's perfect.
Oh, I couldn't believe it.
Again, I can't believe how many people are familiar with you and your family.
Yeah.
That's amazing. That's awesome.
Yeah.
What are the odds that someone would pass you?
Yeah.
And go, I think I know you.
Yeah. And it would happen to me all the time.
Well, that's good.
Yeah.
That worked out well. So
But-
when did you get married? What year?
Well,
Is this,
when I got home on that trip, I took a day to catch up on my sleep. I called Jenny, and she said, "Yeah, I'd love to see you." So I borrowed the car from my dad and went to Point Pleasant. And 2 or 3 days later, she said yes. And I'd maybe hinted at the question in a letter or two. But we had an engagement of 3 weeks, and her foster family, her father was an Episcopal minister, and her mother, foster mother, was just a beautiful person. But she arranged a wedding for us. He married us in his church. I didn't even have to pay the preacher. But before we were married, he was talking with me and giving me the quiz, and he said, "Are you related to the Stanleys that live up here on the Kanawha River?" I said, "No, I don't think so. We're maybe back 5 generations." And he said, "Well, okay." Right away, I knew to be on my toes. And he said, "Well, do you have a car out west?" And I said, "Yeah, I have an old Buick." I didn't tell him how old. So that seemed to satisfy him that I had transportation. But Jenny had been a telephone operator part-time. She graduated at 16, and she already had her admission to Marshall College for the fall of '52. And of course, that changed. We got married, and 3 days later, we flew to California. My dad gave us airplane tickets. He said, "You don't have to hitchhike back." But that we were a team from then on. She was a perfect Air Force wife. She was pretty much the den mother for the other wives wherever we went. People gravitated to her. But when we got to California, a few days, well, we stayed in a motel a couple of nights. I had made no plans because I didn't know what would happen. So a couple of nights in a motel, and we rented a small apartment in an older house, an upstairs apartment. And a month or so later, we found a new apartment about 5 blocks from where she was working. So she would walk to work, and I would ride to work 10 miles with coworkers, or I'd ride the bus. So first 18 months we were married, we didn't have a car. But I had so many friends there in California. Well, the 10 guys, of the 10 of us, there were 4 who were from that area of California. And their families were there, and we would visit their families. These guys had cars, and they showed us all over the state, all of the beautiful sights. And we'd go to San Francisco, and we took the girls to eat Japanese food once. They weren't too impressed.
Part of the country to hang out in.
Yeah, but we went to the Redwoods, and went to one of our favorite spots was the Russian River north of, near the wine country. And we'd go up there for swimming and hiking. And she was adopted by the older girls at the telephone company, so we made some civilian friends. They just took her under their wing like a little sister. And finally, it was a good time.
How many years were you there before you got the call to go to Europe? Or how'd that come about?
We were there, let's see, we got there in really 1st of August of '52. Left there in October of '53. But in the summer of '53, I was sent on loan to the Wyoming Air National Guard. There were 4 of us who were to be supervisors for the control tower while the National Guard did their summer camp flying. And during the summer, we were there for the Wyoming Guard. I think the Nebraska National Guard came in, and one other state. But they would fly for 2 weeks and then leave, and we'd have a week off before the next unit came in. So during that week off, we would, one of the guys had a new car, so we'd drive back to California to spend the weekend or pretty much the whole week with our families. But on one of the breaks, my wife got on a Greyhound and came up to see me. And in the meantime, the owner of the car, my good friend Ed, 2 of us had pulled him out of a lake up in the mountains where it was so cold we shouldn't have been swimming in the first place. And Ed said, "You saved my life, so you can borrow my car anytime you want." It was a brand new '53 Bel Air Chevrolet. So Jenny and I took his car for a week and went to Jackson Hole, Wyoming, and Yellowstone Park. And we had a great time. Let's see, she had turned 21 by then. So
well, it sounds like you're fulfilling your goal when you joined. When you wanted to join the Navy to see the world, you joined the Air Force, and you're seeing the world anyway.
I saw more of the world than I probably would have in the Navy.
Yeah, absolutely so.
Yeah.
When was your first child born?
I'm sorry?
First child.
First child was Mike.
Yeah.
Michael. He was born in Langley Air Force Base, Virginia, in 1954. 65 years ago today.
Yeah.
And now he's retired.
How long were you there at Langley?
1 year, almost exactly. When I left California, the Korean War was winding down, and from not enough people in the control tower, we had trained a bunch of new people out of school, Air Force school, over the time I was there, so we had a surplus. Most of the people we trained were sent overseas, but some of them were kept there. So they offered me an early discharge, gave me a week to make up my mind. So we had a family conference, and of course she was a little bit homesick, and I was too. So I made a call to one of my civilian contacts in air traffic control over in Oakland, California. And he said, "Yeah, we're hiring here in California, but I don't know about East Coast. So I took a chance and I took the discharge, went home, applied for a civilian controller job in the Washington, D.C. area, which covered West Virginia. I applied in November. I got an answer in December saying, yeah, we'd love to talk to you next July. So by then, our savings were mostly used up. And at another conference, and Jenny said, well, guess what? I'm going to have a baby. So she said, should we go back in the Air Force? And I said, well, I'd like to. I love the job. So I made a few more calls, and I discovered that if I re-enlisted in Charleston, which was the capital of the state, I would be sent to Langley, Virginia, Langley Air Force Base, near Hampton, Virginia. If I re-enlisted in Huntington, I'd be sent to Wright-Patterson, Ohio. So we had bought a used car by then, so we drove the 170 miles over to Wright-Patterson and toured part of the base, and we decided, well, it's too big and too spread out. Let's go to Virginia. So I went back to Charleston, signed up for, I think I signed up for 4 more years and was sent to Langley, Virginia. And they told me when I checked in at Langley that, well, you can have on-base housing in a couple of weeks. And they also told me that we've got too many controllers, but we'll find a job for you. And I said, well, that, you know, I had no choice. I was already committed. And a couple of weeks later, there were 2 of us. I met this guy when I was checking in. He had re-enlisted. He had been a World War II vet, air traffic controller, but he'd never gone overseas. He had enlisted late in the war. And he was 1 rank ahead of me, and so he and I were assigned together to work on what they called the bomb range. It was a gunnery practice area for air-to-ground gunnery. It was on an island in Chesapeake Bay, 4 or 5 miles from the Air Force Base. And we were in charge of putting up the targets and calling the aircraft in and keeping them in their proper sequence. And then after they fired their mostly rockets and machine guns, we'd go out and score the targets and then call them and let them know. Far cry from what I'd been doing, but interesting. It was a forerunner of the current controllers who go with the infantry to call in airstrikes. But we never took it that far. We were in that job maybe 8 months, and they transferred us to the control tower, which we had wanted. And no sooner than we got there, the first sergeant came in and said, well, guess what? You guys are probably going to Europe, the 2 of you, the first of the year. And we said, well, what can you do? I had expected it, of course. So that's how we ended up in France. Well, first I had a stop in Spain. We were sent to Spain as advisors to the Spanish military controllers at the international airport in Madrid. At that time, this was early '55, all the air traffic control in Spain was by the military. So a squadron of our American Air Force fighters had been authorized to operate at Madrid. So we were there to help translate the accents. All air traffic control in most countries was and still is in English. So some of the foreign to us controllers had trouble with the accents. So we were there to help keep communications, clear. And we didn't have any resentment. It was kind of a thing, that, well, we'd all tell stories about our, you know, our American growing up, and they would tell us about growing up in Spain. We were all about the same age. So that lasted, we lived in a hotel downtown, rode the American Embassy bus to work. We had to wear civilian clothes. We had an allowance for that so we wouldn't, you know, step on sensibilities. We were the first military there since World War II, actually stationed there. And it worked out pretty well.
Now, you were training military who were doing the air traffic controlling, but were you training civilians as well at that time, or was that just military?
None of the civilians had their own school for air traffic control for the civilian airports.
Okay.
And most countries operated the same way. But because the Spanish International Airport was by the military air traffic controllers, they used us military guys to help them out.
Right. Just you guys were in civilian clothing while you were doing it.
Yeah. I don't know. Maybe they felt that the Spanish would not be happy with American military people in their country. We found out that was not true at all. And we didn't fool anybody. We wore our military dress shoes, and we had our haircuts.
Less imposing.
Yeah. And in the hotel, the waiters, day one, knew we were Americans. We would point to the menu and what we thought was what we wanted to eat. Learned a little Spanish to order a meal. And pretty soon the waiters would come in and they'd say, okay, point to what you want. They're English. Well, it's good, you know. It was a hotel for international travelers. And that only lasted about 2.5 months. And with the reports they got from us, our officers decided, well, they don't really need to be there. So I had a scare. The captain there said, well, I think we're probably going to have to send you to North Africa because we don't need you here. I said, well, thanks a lot. But a few days later, they said, well, you two guys are going to France. There are new Air Force bases, brand new, opening up in France. And so they put us on an Air Force cargo plane and flew us into Central Air Force Base here in France. I forget the name of it. But then they gave us train tickets to Paris, and then on out to, everything went through Paris, on out to where we were going to be stationed. It was called Etienne Air Base. And so we spent the night in Paris, had a good meal, and got on the train. Learned on the train going into Paris and the train to eastern France, we had ham sandwiches and beer because they understand that in any language. And
what a combination.
Yeah. But when I went to Spain, I was told that the family probably would not be able to join me there. And Jenny and the baby were going to stay with her foster parents, who had by then had transferred to the church in Clarksburg, West Virginia. So I wasn't real happy about that part of it, but I was really happy when I learned I was going to Spain, to France, because I knew I could take the family there. And that turned out to be a good thing.
How long were you in France? Were any of the kids
A little over 3 years.
Were the kids born there?
I'm sorry?
Were any of your children born in France?
Becky, our oldest daughter, was born in France.
Okay.
She had dual citizenship until she was 21. And then after she turned 21, I said, well, now, Becky, the French will never be able to draft you. Because they were drafting women before we were. Well, we're not drafting women yet, but the French were drafting women before.
Yeah.
So,
of
course.
Tell me a little bit more about France here. How long were you there?
I was there 3 years.
3 years.
When I got there, we had the runways, the airplane hangars, barracks, mess hall, a chapel. The roads were gravel. The control tower had not been finished. There was no equipment in it. Our control tower was an Army 6x6 truck with a bubble on top sitting by the runway. And we were there in that probably 6 or 8 months before the control tower was ready. But it was interesting watching everything be built. And I learned that the family housing would probably, this was in late March, I learned that the family housing would probably not be ready until maybe September, October. So I sent Jenny a letter. I said, would you be willing to buy a ticket and come on over and we'll rent in the French farm village? And the next letter I got from her, she said, well, I applied for my passport and we're getting ready. And Mike was, 7 months old then? And shortly after that, she visited my cousin Carolyn, her best friend from high school, our Cupid, although she didn't know it at the time. And Carolyn's baby had the mumps, had just recovered from the mumps. And Jenny was helping to wash some of the bedclothes, and she caught the mumps. Had to delay her trip for almost a month. But anyway, one of the guys I worked with I told him, I guess, that I was going to have my wife come over and we were going to rent an apartment if we could find one. And he said, well, I'll join you. I said, my wife is the same age, and we have a little boy, almost the same age. So we started house hunting, and we found a vacant hotel/bar in a village about 5 miles from the base. And 2 other guys whose wives were about the age of ours decided that they would talk their wives into coming over. They didn't have children. So we were able to rent this old building. We installed a gas line for a propane kitchen stove, and the rooms upstairs, there were 4 bedrooms plus a kitchen, and there was only 1 cold water faucet in the kitchen, 1 toilet that you flushed by pouring water into it. We didn't tell the girls all of this, but I told Jenny, I said, well, it's pretty much like I grew up on the farm, so she knew. And she said, well, I'm coming anyway. So all of the women they were women, nearly girls. They arrived about the same time, and we all moved into this commune. It didn't have a bad name then, the word commune. So we got there and we said, hey, we got, instead of 2 babysitters, we now have 4. And it was a great thing the way it worked out. We bought, our supply sergeant on the base let us check out Army cots, blankets, sheets and pillows. We bought, and I believe we had nightstands, a couple of clothing wardrobes, and then we bought all of the kitchen essentials in the PX. We bought galvanized wash tubs downtown for bathing. That's what I grew up with. And the girls weren't too crazy about that at first, but we were together there about 4 or 5 months, and it worked out great. We stayed friends with these people for many years after we left France, and the women, were my friend Tom. His little boy was Tommy. So Tommy and Mike had these, you might say, godmothers, so to speak. But I've got pictures of Mike and Tommy in a galvanized bathtub together having their bath.
This all sounds like a pretty nice little arrangement.
Yeah,
yeah. If you'd have help when you need it.
Cooperation.
Yeah, cooperation.
And Tom's wife, Franny, grew up in Maine. Her parents were French Canadian, and she spoke French. So Franny would go with us when we're going to a restaurant or a store in town, and she would negotiate the French price for us, not the American price. And the storekeepers didn't like to see Franny coming because she was a beautiful girl, but she had their number.
So how many years altogether were you in Europe?
Just a few months in Spain, about 3.5 years.
Okay.
Yeah.
And then what was next?
We were due to come home in the spring of '58. Becky had been born in '57, and she was, and Mike was a toddler. So while we were there, we took quite a few mini vacations in all of the surrounding countries. Had a good time. Our work schedule allowed us quite a few long weekends. And when we left France, I had requested, my first choice was Tampa, Florida. I got an assignment to the state of Washington.
Close.
Close, yeah. That would seem to be typical of the Air Force at that time. We used to call it, they'd ask you to fill out your choices. We called it the dream sheet.
At least you got the right country.
I got the right country. So when we got back, we traded in our small French car for a big American V8 Ford station wagon with a potty chair in the back. Had room for all of our luggage. So we had a great trip at home. We saw all the family and some of the friends and some of the relatives, and then took off for Washington. Took the northern route, and it was a good trip. I had miscalculated on my money. Back then, there were no credit cards, of course. I had a checking account at my hometown bank in West Virginia. So I started getting worried, and about halfway across Washington, which is a fairly wide state, I stopped at a bank to try to cash a check, and they wouldn't cash my check. I was in uniform. I put my uniform on specifically to go to the bank, and he said, "Well, you can go out to the base and get an officer to co-sign for you, and we'll cash your check." And I said, "Forget it." And so I got in the car and we went on. When I got to Washington, I had about $2.50 left in my pocket. So, fortunately, we checked in at the base guest house, and I didn't have to pay until I got to finance to get my back pay. And we stayed there overnight, and next day I got my pay and paid that bill, and I think we rented a motel for a couple of nights. But within a week, I had rented a small 2-bedroom house off base, about 2 miles from work, and signed in at the office and went to work in the control tower.
How long were you in Washington?
8 months.
Okay.
Yeah.
You're seeing the world.
Yeah.
You've seen the country a lot.
Yeah. I got to go with several of my new friends. Went fishing a few times in the streams there. We could always see Mount Rainier. This was at Tacoma, Washington, near Seattle. Mount Rainier always in the background. Beautiful, beautiful sight. I'd go fishing, 2 or 3 times a month. And we had a yard finally that we had to mow. And bought some furniture. I'd been there 7 or 8 months, and they asked me if I'd like to transfer back to California, this time to Southern California. They were opening up the brand new intercontinental ballistic missile base, Vandenberg Air Force Base. I'm sure you've heard of it. The airport runways were finished, taxiways, no control tower. I was back in an Army truck with a bubble on top by the side of the runway, breathing all the jet fumes for maybe 5 months. And we rented a house in town. And brand new base housing opened up, so I moved the family into the base housing. 3-bedroom, ranch style, living like a king. And it was good duty. So we watched the progress of the missile sites being built, and I've got our new control tower built. Our landing approach radar trailer was still by the runway. When the captain decided that all the control tower operators should also learn how to operate the radar landing system, which was much more technical. And we on-the-job training, which was all I had in the Air Force. My first on-the-job training in air traffic control would not have been possible except that it was wartime. So while at home, we were living the good life, but at work I was learning a new job so I could do either job. And learned it mostly by reading the book and by the guy at my shoulder saying, "No, dummy, you don't do it that way."
Hands-on training, right?
Yeah, right.
You're now required to learn this, so you will.
I was a staff sergeant, and he was a tech sergeant. He was a good friend. But after about 6 months, I had my certification there, and I was a double threat.
Okay, so you're in Southern California now.
Mm-hmm.
How long there?
Almost 4 years.
Well, this is a long time.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. And I knew I was going to have to go overseas again, and in spring of 1962, I got orders for the Philippines. And it was to a specialized unit. They called it a mobile communications group. And it left my wife. By then, our third child had been born. She was a baby when I got my orders for overseas. And this new outfit, well, I left first, naturally. I caught a plane out of Travis Air Force Base, leaving Jenny to close up the house, oversee all the packing, make sure the house is fit shine for inspection. And I think after I'd been gone about a month, I believe the kids caught the chicken pox. So that delayed our trip.
You sense a theme here.
It was chicken pox or measles, one or the other. But they finally, while I was there, I rented an off-base Philippine-style house on the main road, which was 2 miles from the base. The main road from the Manila metropolitan area ran all the way to the northern tip of Luzon. In the back of my mind, I knew about that road because the Filipinos named it the Death March Highway. And our house was like 25 feet from the edge of the highway. But I didn't tell my wife that at first.
Hard to break the news that you're going to be living on the Death March Highway.
She wouldn't have worried about it. But the Filipinos were great allies. from World War II clear up until one of the presidents kicked us out in the, 70s or 80s. But we had Filipino neighbors, and on one side we had a rice paddy, and the other side the Filipino neighbors, and they would sometimes treat us to the sounds and the odors of a pig roast, which my wife didn't like, and the kids didn't like. Of course, they felt sorry for the pig. But it was the beginning of some not so good times and some good times. A couple of weeks after they arrived and we got set up, I was sent to Bangkok, Thailand, as an advisor to the military controllers in the tower at the international airport. Same job I'd had in Spain for a short while. This was to be for 3 months. And when I got there, first shift on duty, I was amazed. They had probably 10 people in the control tower, and most of them were talking about what they did on their weekend, and one or two guys paying attention to the air traffic and the runway. And I'm in the background, I don't want to throw my weight around. The only difference there was I was in uniform, and these guys also were in uniform. We had no authority over them. We were, because of the international airport, in that busy part of the world, we had airliners coming in almost all day, in and out, from all over Asia. Pilots speaking English in different accents. And we had, I think it was 2 squadrons of World War II F-86 American jet fighters that we had given to the Thai Air Force. And we had American cargo jets coming in and out, periodically. So there was a need for someone in the tower whose native language was English, mine, and the other guys I worked with. So that was why we were there. And it was kind of like a Chinese fire drill in the control tower with all those people. And one day I was working, and the Air National Guard of the Thai Air National Guard was flying practice. Well, the main reason I was there at that time was the Vietnam War was building up. So we had more Americans in and out. And one day I was working, and I think that day there were 13 Thai controllers. Some of them were trainees. But what we called the local controller, the guy who had the microphone in charge of the airport traffic pattern, was looking away for some reason. I was watching the jet fighter, our old F-86, land, and he was too short of the runway. And he hit the lip of the runway, his landing gear broke off. He's sliding down the runway, sparks flying, and the local controller didn't see it. So I punched him with my elbow, and hey, look at that. So he hit the panic button for the fire department. And I didn't report it, I knew they weren't going to change their style of operation. But that was one time when I was there and did a little, came in handy.
How was the pilot?
He didn't get hurt at all.
Okay.
But some of the controllers were laughing when it was all over, all the sparks flying, Right. I don't know, it wasn't the trainees. They were too scared. But that was my one exciting experience in Bangkok.
You mentioned a few minutes ago this was some bad times during this time.
Those came later.
Yeah.
When I came back from Bangkok, we had 3 months on deployment and a month off. But during that period, we had a lot of time off to spend time with our families, and we'd check in at the office, and they would know where we were. Sometimes we were in the NCO club. drinking free iced tea through, a couple hours of the day. And then we'd go home and stay with the family. But sometimes at work we'd debrief people that were going to our same last assignment. And we would write questions for tests, which would be used for promotion boards and that sort of thing. Air traffic control themes. And, make work. But our NCO club had great food, and they had a barber shop there. Filipino barbers cost a quarter for a haircut. All this was subsidized by the profits of the PX and the clubs. And I don't know if you've ever heard, but most of the resorts for military overseas were paid for by PX profits. They weren't paid for by the government. So we had still living good. And not long after that, I got an assignment to the Manila International Airport, doing pretty much the same thing I'd done in Bangkok. But I was only required to be there 5 days a week, 8 to 5, lived in a nice hotel near the embassy, took the bus to the airport. Friday evening, I'd catch the long-range bus, ride the bus back, get off in front of my house, and spend a weekend with my family. Sunday night, bus would stop for me. I'd get on the bus, go back to Manila, to my hotel. Going back to town, usually a bunch of farmers with produce, chickens in cages. One time, a guy had a live pig in a cage on the bus. He's going to the market Monday morning. These Filipinos would look at me. I wore civilian clothes for this job, and they'd look at me kind of funny, and I'd say, I'm just going to work. It was a friendly type deal. And my job there was for mostly inbound civilian airliners who may have a question or have an emergency, and that I could call up the American emergency crew, as the Filipinos would take care of the Filipino emergency crew. And it was fun. Mike went with me one time. I think he stayed a week at the hotel while I worked, and I may have taken him to work, but he enjoyed seeing the area around Manila Bay and all those sites. He was, I don't know, 6 or 7 by then. But it was an interesting experience. And after 3 months, I'm back in the pool, having my month at home, waiting to go somewhere else. But I think at that time we were able to take a mini vacation to the area of Baguio in the Philippines, which is pretty high in the mountains, cool weather, low humidity. They had a little amusement park for the kids, nice cabins to live in. But the road up to Baguio, up through the mountains, was worse than the winding roads in West Virginia back in the 30s. I mean, some places you could go 30 miles an hour if you were lucky. No guardrails. But I grew up with roads like that. But the thing is, my dad wouldn't let me drive the car because I guess he was afraid I'd wreck it. Of course, I only had my license 1 year. I got my license when I was 16, and I never drove his car until I'd been overseas for 3 years and back.
You mentioned a few minutes ago, we're getting to the point now where we're kind of ramping up toward the Vietnam conflict. Tell me a little bit more about what was going on there as far as your involvement with that.
That was my next deployment. It was May of '63. We were on loan to the Army. There was already a team there of my coworkers. They had opened up. The Army had built a This was in Can Tho, Vietnam, right near the southern tip of the country. The city, I don't know, was probably, hard to tell, 50,000, maybe more, maybe less. My orders, when I got them, I looked at them, and I was taken aback a minute. It said, operational weapon is required. So that gave me a clue. And they said, at first, civilian clothes. You wouldn't be in uniform. I figured out later it was to make us less of a target. But I checked out my weapon and got all my gear and got on a cargo plane. And we landed in Saigon, and then I got on an Army Caribou type aircraft. It was noted for bush pilot training in Alaska, bush pilot flying. They were a very nice aircraft. And I flew into Can Tho. I was by myself, which was unusual. But they were kind of replacing the guys there one by one for some reason. I guess to have continuity. And I landed at the Can Tho airport where our controllers were in the tower there, and they had a truck ready to take me into town, and the Army had rented a private residence, a large one, and next door was I guess call it a squad of Army guys. They were in a house. We had an entryway between the two houses like that with a gate. And on the way into town from the airport, the guy was telling me, he says, well, last week a kid threw a grenade into that entryway, so we really have to be on our toes. So I got into my civilian clothes and got ready to go to work the next day, and met all the guys that were off duty. And when I got back to the airport, I noticed an A-team of American Special Forces Army had built a makeshift camp at the airport. And we had runway lights and taxiway lights, but the buildings had no lighting. So our crew had 2 generators, one a backup, which we provided our own electricity for our radios. And I met the Army First Lieutenant, and after a couple of days, he approached me and said, I see you guys have a spare generator. Can we borrow it? Because we have kerosene lanterns in our quarters and in our kitchen, and we're using batteries for our radios. So I said, sure, just so we can get it back if we have an emergency. And we agreed. And so after that, the Air Force guys were number one with them. We were the heroes because they fired up their. Our generator maintenance guy put in the wiring for their hut and their kitchen and their comm center. So, he was the golden boy. But to repay us, they invited us for a pig roast. And so that was a lot of fun. The guy that was in charge of the kitchen that evening, they kept teasing him. They told us, they said, that his main job is the demolitions man. And he said, you can sure tell it by the way he cooks.
Were there times while you were in Vietnam, as opposed to other places where you were stationed, obviously, you're in the middle of a conflict now. Was it different? Was there ever any fear of what could have happened or what could be happening around you?
Yeah, a little bit, because after I had been there maybe 2 weeks, we got the word that we were to be back in uniform. The Army guys had been in uniform all along. And so we put on our uniforms, and the first sergeant of the Army group had told us that if you decide to get a haircut in town, rather than letting your buddies chop it off, take one guy with you and make sure that his weapon is visible while you're getting your haircut. So that was a clue. But the main thing that happened, I'd been there about 6 weeks, and the guy came in our room. There was about 6 of us in one large room. And he said, "Hey, did you hear about the airport being attacked by the Viet Cong?" So we jumped in the truck and ran out there. It happened the night before. 2 of those Special Forces soldiers had been wounded, and the Army had flown them out at daybreak, to Saigon for treatment. And our control tower had about 10 bullet holes in the glass. So at that point, I was kind of worried. But I had known one of those guys that was wounded. And as it turned out, I don't think they told our wives back at Clark Field that the tower had been under attack, even though there was no one in it. Where it very well could have been. But we would shut down at dark and open up again at daybreak. But the Viet Cong then, they operated mostly at night. And the Special Forces guys were wounded by a mortar, and they suspected that one of the guys they had hired, one of the Vietnamese guys, had somehow given the enemy the measurements to get to fire a mortar onto the camp. And it turned out that no matter how it happened, they were hit. But later on, after I got back to Clark Field, I heard that this lieutenant that I was acquainted with, he was a real gentleman, had been captured by the Viet Cong. Those Special Forces guys would usually send maybe 2 or 3 Americans out with each Vietnamese Army unit to possibly call in airstrikes if needed, but act as advisors. That's what they were titled. And this lieutenant had been captured. I found his book that he wrote after his captivity. I found it in 1989 after I read a newspaper article about this guy, and I looked at the newspaper and, hey, I know this guy. But he was kept he wrote the title of his book, 5 Years to Freedom. And he escaped several times and was beaten severely after each time, but while he was in captivity, 3 of his comrades were starved to death. In huts, cages, really. He was kept in a bamboo cage, off and on, for 5 years. I never saw him again, but I read his book. During his time in captivity, he was promoted from first lieutenant to major, and then he spent several years at Fort Bragg teaching new Green Beret units escape and evasion. And the reason he was able to escape, there was a flight of Army helicopters flying over, and his guards hid, and he ran out into an open field, and one of the helicopters almost fired on him, thinking he was in the black pajamas. And somebody looked again and said, "Hey, wait a minute, that guy's got a long black beard. He's not Asian." So they landed and picked him up, brought him home. But the tragic part of it was when he was a colonel, several years later, he was on duty in the Philippines, long after I had left there, and he was killed by a bomb by the communists in southern Philippines. I forget the year, but it was several years after his captivity. So that was my experience in Vietnam. Glad to get out of it.
No doubt.
Yeah.
So where do you go from there?
One thing I'd like to mention about Vietnam, the Army sergeants were all amazed at the authority we had as Air Force tech sergeants, which was equivalent to an Army sergeant first class. And when I got there, one of the sergeants said, "Where's your officer?" And I said, "We don't need one." And I think he reported that to the colonel. And when I saw the colonel, he was just laughing at me. He knew what the score was. The colonel happened to be a West Point guy.
Was Vietnam, was that the toughest part of your service, do you think?
I think so, yeah. The fact that people that I knew got hurt. And later on, I was in Thailand in a jungle, in a Air Force base with jungle all around it. That was not pleasant. But the Vietnam experience, I think, we were, most of us young, not well educated. Most of them had just a high school diploma. I'm talking about Air Force people now. Army people were in the same category. At that time, in the summer of 1963, I think most of the lower ranking people knew that this was a big mistake to be there. And I would tell my wife that these young guys had more common sense than some of the people that are supposed to be our leaders. But the Vietnamese people that we came in contact with had absolutely no use for their government, no support at all for their government. And they weren't sure that they wanted communism, but I think they were, at that time even, had already accepted the fact that they were going to be conquered by the communists in the North, no matter what we did, and that turned out to be true. So, but when you have 12, 13-year-old kids throwing grenades at your house where you live, that's a pretty good clue that the people are not behind you.
Very different kind of warfare.
Yeah, it's something that we had never encountered.
Well, let's go on to a lighter subject.
Oh, yeah.
Let's talk about, how much longer did you serve?
I'm sorry?
How much longer were you in the service after you?
Oh, okay. I got back to Clark Field and I enjoyed another few months, and then I was sent to what was a new Air Force base we built in the jungles in northern Thailand, small town of Tok Lee. We had, I think we had 3 squadrons of jet fighter bombers, and their job was to, they would fly over Vietnam, and if the ground controller called them in for an airstrike, they would try to hit the enemy. And there I worked primarily in the radar unit. When the planes were coming back from a mission, if the weather was bad, they would sometimes want a landing directed by radar. And that was, in a way, not a good assignment for me, but I knew it was my last one. And the snakes were a big problem there. We were terrified of the what they called the king cobra, and we'd see them on the roadways, taxiways. One of my friends, actually he was my roommate in the Philippines before my family got there for a month, maybe a month and a half. He went into an empty room where we were going to put supplies, and this cobra was in there. And Bill didn't run right away, but the cobra spit venom into his face. So they immediately got him, washed his face as well as they could, and put him on a plane to Bangkok for treatment. But it was that kind of an atmosphere. And at night, we had army cots and mosquito nets, and if you sleep with your hand up against a mosquito net, next morning you'd be covered with 10 or 12 mosquito bites where they bite you through the net, you know. It was that kind of a situation. We couldn't drink the water. We had to treat our own water with Clorox. So it was kind of like living in the field. Food there wasn't bad, which made it, and no entertainment. The guys formed softball teams, and I did a lot of reading in off-duty time. I've always loved to read, and I got caught up on my reading. And I was there 3 months. But that reminds me of the snake story. In the Philippines, the cobras there were about 2.5 feet long, the mature cobras, and they weren't, you know, there wasn't a lot of them. There were hardly any of them on the base, although there were areas that would have snakes. But on one of my off times, I was at home kind of cleaning up the backyard. I had a steel garden rake with a long wooden handle. I was cleaning up. I saw a cobra, a small one, right near our back stoop. The kids were in the house, and my wife was in there. So I took the rake with both hands on the handle, and I held that snake down so it couldn't move, except it was moving its head. And I yelled for Jenny. I said, "Hey, come out here and bring a butcher knife and give me some help." And she said, "What's going on?" So she came out, and I said, "I can't take a hand off this rake, because if I do, he might get away." And so she took the knife, leaned over, and cut that snake's head off. And after that, of course, we were both shaken, and I said, how did you do that? And she said, "The kids were in the house." You know, the screen door was loose. And I said, later on, I said, "Well, I'm kind of glad you grew up on a farm like I did." Although she didn't grow up on a farm. I mean, it was close to farms, and all of
that takes a lot of nerve.
all of her siblings had grown up on farms. But she was a mama bear when it came to the kids. And I told her brothers about that when we got home. They can't believe it, because she was always their protector. But she, like I think I maybe mentioned, she and I were a team. I lost her in a car wreck 2.5 years ago, and I'll never get over it. But
how many years were you married?
We were married 2 months short of 65 years. So
that's wonderful.
yeah, the kids are my blessings. They still take care of me. Our youngest son can't be here today. He works for Microsoft, and he's in Dallas today, selling software, making money for Bill Gates.
Well, and your grandson's one of my best DJs at the radio.
Yeah. Oh, we love Sam. He's I call him number 5. I have 8 grandsons.
Right, Larry, let's talk a little bit here. We'll go ahead and kind of jump forward toward the end of your service here. I know I said we'd talk for a long time. We're about an hour and 50 minutes in.
Mm-hmm.
So tell me a little bit about the day your service ended. Do you remember it?
Yes, yeah. When I came back from the Philippines, I served an extra year in the Philippines to help operate their radar approach control unit. That was different because we controlled traffic out to 200 miles. And of course we had the precision radar equipment in the same building. So I volunteered for that extra year, knowing that when I got back to the States, that would put me to the point where I had 17 years in the service as opposed to 16 if I came back when I was eligible. So I got orders for Clinton County Air Force Base at Wilmington, Ohio in probably May of '65. And I told the clerk, I said, I think that base is closed. And he said, no, it opened up again for Air National Guard and Air Force Reserve training. And I thought for a minute, and I said, well, they're putting me out to pasture. and that was about the size of it. Except when I got here, I'd been promoted to Master Sergeant by then. When I got here, I was the only Master Sergeant in Air Traffic Control, so I was in charge of that, and whole new challenges, paperwork mostly, and overseeing training, which of course was important. We're still training controllers for the Vietnam War. Kept me busy, and I enjoyed it. And my new captain here was a great guy, and he just left it up to me to take care of things. But
And you settled here.
we bought a house here, our first house. This captain that I mentioned is now a lieutenant colonel, retired, lives out on Hale Road here in Wilmington. He guards his privacy well, and I'm trying to talk him into taking a little more credit. He had a great career in the Air Force too. But he transferred to Wright Pat when I'd been here a little over a year, and then a year or so later shortly after that he went to Vietnam after some training in escape and evasion. He was a pilot and an air traffic controller. But I knew he'd kept his home here in Wilmington, serving. He went to Vietnam, from there to Europe, Germany, and came back and settled here. But when we came here, we bought our house. This captain signed the papers attesting that I was eligible for a VA loan. We bought a house over in Denver Aviation, 4 bedrooms, 2.5 baths, had the 3 children. Very little furniture. Most of it had been banged up, moving around the world, in storage. Paid $1,000 down, $137 a month for 30 years. And first house we ever owned, I still live in it. Kids live close by.
Perfect.
Yeah. We adopted Wilmington. Or they adopted us, I guess. I was out at Clinton County Air Force Base a year and a half, a little over. The senior sergeant at Wright Pat retired, and they said, would you like to go to Wright Pat, transfer up there? And I said, bingo, knowing that the transfer protected me for 1 more year for overseas. And it worked out perfectly. At Wright Pat, our office oversaw the air traffic control operations on paper here at Clinton County, and also at Springfield Municipal Airport, which is operated by Air Force controllers. Maybe it still is, I don't know. But the reason for the Air Force controllers at the tower, they had no civilian controllers there. The Air National Guard had a fighter wing there at the Springfield Airport. So our job in the office at Wright Pat was to do any necessary paperwork for all 3 airports. And it was interesting. And I got promoted to Senior Master Sergeant while I was up there. And primarily because of my old captain here gave me a glowing report. And of course, I think I did a good job for him. I liked the job, so I did a good job everywhere I was. But when I got to, well, I'd been at Wright Pat almost 2 years, and our colonel was encouraging me to re-enlist. He said, I think I can get you an assignment to Germany if you would consider re-enlisting. We kept our home here in Wilmington. At that time, we had been here 3 years. Yeah. And I wasn't eager to move. So I was almost on the verge of telling him that I would re-enlist. And I said, give me a week or so to think about it. And he said, okay. So after I had thought about it a while, I went back and he said, well, I'm sorry to tell you that if you re-enlist, they're going to send you to Korea for a year without your family. And I said, well, sir, where are those retirement papers? I had just over 20 years in. I was 38 years old. I knew I was going to have a job. I've got 3 hungry kids, got a mortgage, got a car payment. So I retired from there. The day I retired, I turned in my security pass, walked out the door and came home. Just like coming home from a civilian job because, I was settled where I wanted to be. I applied for a job as a civilian air traffic controller, knowing it probably wouldn't work out. But I got accepted if I would work in Cleveland or Indianapolis. And I talked it over with Jenny, and I said, I don't want to live in a city, do you? And she said, no, I want to live here in Wilmington. So here we are.
What did you do after that?
About 3 weeks later, I had a job as a loan officer at the credit union at Clinton County Air Force Base.
Couldn't stay away.
Couldn't stay away. I worked there 2 years and changed. I got a job as a life insurance salesman. I did that for about 25 years. Scott, our youngest son, was born a year after I got out of the Air Force, and when he was about 8, my wife took a job as the manager of the J.C. Penney catalog store. She did that for 18 years and took early retirement, and we spent a lot of time on vacations. Went to Hawaii 6 or 7 times, a place we'd never been stationed.
Trying to hit all the spots you did.
Yeah.
Service. Yeah, of course.
Took 2 or 3 cruises and made time with our families. Of course, by then our parents were gone, but we had a great life. I was very lucky that my stumbling into the Air Force as a 17-year-old kid worked out to be pretty great.
You intended to enlist in the Navy, ended up in the Air Force, and
right.
the rest is history.
Yep, that's true. My good buddy from high school, junior high, Feisty Rumbaugh, had been in the Navy, and I saw him a few times over the years, and I said, the Navy can never beat the Air Force.
Well, I'll tell you what, on that note, we'll wrap things up.
Okay.
Larry Stanley, thank you so much for joining us here today.
Well, I hope I didn't bore you.
Thank you for sharing your stories with us.
Yeah.
This has been a lot of fun.
Well, I had some unusual experiences. Some of them I volunteered for, and it usually worked out best. But I was always had a curiosity about what's over the next hill, and interested in all kinds of history, military history too.
Well, very nice. Thank you for joining us here on the Clinton County Veterans Oral History Project. This is Nick Wiget from Wilmington College reporting. Thank you for tuning in.
Thank you, Nick. It was great.